Welcome to ParentData by Emily Oster. This is Emily. I'm a professor of economics at Brown University and a mom of two. I write a newsletter called ParentData, and on this podcast, I'll read it to you. If you want to read the newsletter yourself and see more of my writing on parenting and pregnancy, you can sign up for free at www.parentdata.org. And now for today's newsletter. I am so delighted to welcome Majka Burhardt. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's awesome to be here, Emily.
So we're here to talk about your book more. And I have to say, I was very skeptical when you reached out because I expected this to be a book about rock climbing, which is an activity that I think is very scary. And as a result, I thought that I would just be too scared and not be able to relate. But actually, the book is almost uncomfortably relatable. Alex, who works with me, and I were talking about how we both really couldn't put it down, even at moments when we thought, I'm feeling this a little too much, because it's not really a book about climbing so much. It's really about parenting and partnering when you parent and conflict and all that stuff. And so we're going to get into that. And that's really where I want to focus. I think it's so relatable to so many parents. But first, I want to ask you this sort of basic book question, which is, can you tell us in your own words, what is this book? Why did you write it? And what do you hope people will get out of it?
Yeah, I love hearing that it was like kind of itchy and close to you, because really for me, this book was how I survived being pregnant and then being a mom to young twins. And I didn't set out to write this book. I wrote this book like the way a teenager turns to their journal to try to like understand what the heck is going on in their life. And that's really what this book was for me as when I was becoming a mom, and then in my early years of being a mom, and my kids are still really little, they're 6.5 right now. So I'm still at the very beginning of this journey, but I felt like I had this fiery ball of unknown and angst. I needed a place to put it. And so I put it in writing. And eventually I looked at it and said, I think actually, what if I stitched that together? What if this was something I was willing to share with other people? Would they relate? Is this a similar experience? Because I really felt like I wanted to have, those were the conversations I was dying to have with anybody I met on the street. I'd see some random mom and I'd be like, no flipping way. Is it this hard? I had no idea, right? It's like, who knew that all this stuff was going to cascade and feel like this? And how do I find my way to being in a dialogue about it? So in some ways, the book is really selfishly, that's what it was for me. But it's the story of me balancing becoming a mom, thinking that I could have sort of one kid and just mesh them into my lives, and instead having two at one time and having the universe say, guess who's in charge, trying to do it with a really dynamic career between being a professional climber and also growing a major international nonprofit and trying not to tank my marriage.
Yeah. And so far, so good. You're still married. You still have two children. You still have a job. So
check. Yeah.
check. All right. So we're all great.
Yeah. No problem. It was super easy.
So what's interesting about the book is it's written entirely in these form of sort of audio journals and journal entries that you wrote, I presumed, unless you're a very good faker, that you wrote at the time.
Oh yeah, at the time.
And I was curious because it makes the reading of it so very raw in a way that I think it wouldn't be if you had written this in a more traditional book form, where you looked back at those and used those as material, but then you surface them through the experience that you have several years later. Why did you do it? Did you ever consider the more traditional, I'll use this as source material and then write a more regular memoir-y kind of book?
No, I never considered that, because I was just really fascinated with the integrity of, I remember playing myself back these audio recordings when I thought, maybe I'll type these out, see what it's about. And I'm like, something has to happen with these. Maybe it's just that my children are going to listen to them one day. It's like this first person account. And why do we need to change it? Because I think when we do retrospectives, everything gets a little bit blurred, and it's all very lovely, and we kind of round the edges a little bit. It's like, well, I probably wasn't that mad, and it probably was generally okay. And now I have wisdom because I've had better sleep and all these things. But when you're in the middle of it, when you're just in the hot mess of it, if that's what you're trying to speak to, and that's the thing that I would have loved to have, as I said, those are the conversations I wanted to have. To me, it was more important to sit right there in the hot mess of it.
Yeah. And it is hot mess. When you look back on this period and the stuff you wrote about, is there one sort of entry or moment in the book where you would say this was not the low, but like encapsulates the
Mm.
hot messiness of this
That's a
experience?
good question. Wow. I think that things got really, really tricky for me when my kids reached about 2.5. And
Mhm.
suddenly they're trying to, they're having all these big emotions and words. And, I all of a sudden realized that when I was at that age, my parents were splitting up. And I couldn't sit in the moment as a mom and try to tell my kids how to be angry and help them understand that anger was an okay thing without realizing that I never had that skill set given to me when my family was blowing apart. And at the same time, I was dealing with a ton of anger and resentment towards my husband, which I knew wasn't entirely healthy or entirely appropriately directed, but I just couldn't figure out what to do about it. And I think like being at like the Venn diagram of hell that was really, really hard for me, right? Like we always think about like this Venn diagram is like, oh, all these things are related. It's like, no, like it was too much. And I was like, how do I do this? And how do I do it while trying to be like a really patient, lovely mom who can say, yes, I've got you. I'm here for all of your emotions. And like find a way to talk to my husband and say, I feel like this. And I know it's not entirely okay, but something about this is wrong and we need to fix it. And holy God, how do I reparent myself? Like, what are the tools that I have so that I can show up as a different parent to my kiddos?
Yeah. There's so much in there. One thing that's so hard about that is this realization that, oh, I need to parent differently than I was parented, and I don't have those resources, comes in the moment that you need it. It's not
Yeah.
that I'm a year out before I have a child and I think, okay, let me fix all of my issues so I don't pass them to my kid. It's the moment where you think, oh my goodness, I'm passing it right now, and there's no time to
And
fix
I
it.
had no idea. I thought of it so much more intellectually before. It's like, oh yeah, like, I see that my parents did this and here's what I want to carry on. Like you get a choice in the matter, right? But it is not. You are just like the I don't know, like the giant bowling ball is coming at you. You can't get out of the way. And you're just like, okay, here we go. How I'm going to do this. And, how do I keep, it's kind of like the repair concept. Like, how do I try? How do I biff? How do I go back to my kids, the people around me and say, yeah, I'm trying, I'm learning, I'm trying to do something that I don't have the muscle memory for. So I'm trying to create muscle memory and emotional memory in my kiddos while I'm doing it for myself.
I want to ask about the spousal stuff because that is
Yeah.
something that, that's a big piece of this book. And it's one I was interested in because if you look at the data, the first few years of having kids is typically the low point in the data for people's marriages. Sometimes they say like it does recover in the data by the time you have grandchildren. So that's, something to look forward
Oh,
to.
that
Um,
makes it sound like it's
yeah.
like 3 years apart. Okay. That's hysterical.
But I remember this from my own marriages, like that year being the most conflict that we had, more so than the pandemic or the arrival of the second child or when we had to move across the country. Like all of these other disruptions, I felt like we were much more on a team about. And the beginning of parenting had in some ways like weirdly less of a team feel, because there was so much uncertainty. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think it resonates with a lot of people. But the thing is that when I look back on that, I can say, well, that was really hard, but I don't remember all the details. Like I remember one
Yeah.
particular incident involving the rock and play sleeper and napping, but other than that, it is this rounded edges, and I don't relive it with frequency. And of course, writing it in this way, you do relive it with frequency. So I was first wondering, how did that go? Like, how hard was it to have him read that?
Man, it was super hard, to be honest, right? Like it is, this was not something that was really fun to share, to be like, hey, here are my inner workings. But it also seemed to me really important to say, if we're really in this to win it, if we're really this team in the long run, then if you don't know that this is where I was at during this point, are we really being transparent, right? Like,
Mhm.
and not to try to push us to a cliff, but to just be like, this is how hard it was. And this is how scared I was. Peter knew I was working on the book after a certain point, but it wasn't for years because I didn't know I was working on a book. It was really not until like the kids were like 3.5 that I was like, oh, I think this is actually going to be a book. Right. And then I like spent the next year like writing and putting it together and then sending it out. And then it was like, well, I guess it is a book. And I think that for me, it was more important to show up who I am to my spouse than it was to mute that and to like take the risk. And it's been hard. I mean, it's been bumpy. Like I am married to someone who's very private, right? And like that is not his dream. It's like, yay, let's write a book about the hardest part of our lives. And let's not even do it in retrospective with like some nice blurring and some great morals of it's just like, let's be in the shit of it and really show people what that felt like. But to me, I'm like, yeah, but what about the gift that we can give other people to be like, I'm not alone, right? Because it feels so terrifyingly alone. I mean, that's the thing. I remember at one point thinking, well, of course, that's why all these marriages blow apart when people have little kids, or where you like lay the tracks for just so much intense resentment and hatred that you can't pull yourself out of it because you've like, and it's like, we have to have a better way to do this. And I think to have a better way to do this, it's that intersection of all the pieces, right? It's the Marshall Plan for moms. It's like having different conversations about how we're reparenting. It's looking at the data and saying, why are we being led astray with all of these like wives' tales versus like what's really happening? And it's also saying it's this hard. When it's hard, it's this hard. It can't just be fixed by saying, well, just buck up and one day you'll get sleep. And by the time you have grandkids, you'll probably be okay with each other. Like that's bullshit, right?
I'm just reporting the data.
I'm not saying you're bullshit, but I'm just saying like, if we can't solve, we're not gonna be able to solve for this and take care of people and love them and nurture them on this journey unless we're willing to say that like sometimes it feels that hard. So I'm like, all right, I'll fall on the sword. I'll be the person being like, it can feel this hard and I can do it in a public way.
I think one of the things that's so interesting about the way that you write this and the journey we get on here is that there's a lot of discussion of breastfeeding. So and there's a lot of discussion of your experience with breastfeeding and your, and how much you liked it in some sense, or I don't know, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but that's sort of how I read it, that it was complicated, but ultimately
it was really important to me. Yeah. Yeah.
But that I think brings up one of the reasons that some of these, very deep inequities exist, which is that is something that only you could do. And there's this tension of, well, I want the things, and you feel this in the book, and I think a lot of us feel in the world, like I want this to be exactly equal, except I also want this other thing, which only I can do. And somehow, I don't know, I just want it to be different. I want there to be a way for all of those things to happen. And even as far as we could move to make things better, that will always be in the way. And versions of that, the childbirth part, the breastfeeding part, some of those things will always be in the way.
Yeah, it's like there's almost this desire to have a commensurate commitment from the other person to be like, yes, I can't do this, but I will shoulder extra of these other things because you're shouldering these pieces. And it's like, for me, I always get obsessed, and it's in the book. It's like, I try to do the math on things. I'm like, why is this not equal? Like, what's feeling wrong? How do I solve this? And it's like, you can't really apply math to anything because there are these personal choices, right? But definitely my mom's generation, it was not even an option. If you were going to be like a crusher career mother, like you could not say, and I'm also going to try to pick up my kids sometimes at 3:00. No way could you ever do that, right? You just had to like fully be on that other track. And I think now there's this question of what if I can try to have this career and I can try to be really present as a parent. And I think then kind of the corollary to what you were saying, Emily, is your spouse also trying to do all that? Or are they not? And if they aren't, which could be their prerogative and could be the way your agreement is, are you always going to feel like there's a imbalance, right? And it's kind of like carrying the breastfeeding thing or that, like being the birthing parent forward and being like, I'm owning this, but I want to own this because this is what makes my family work. And I wish you were owning something similarly big.
Yeah. And I think, what's so hard about that is that it ventures into the territory of, it's not just that I want you to do the dishes. I want you to love doing the dishes.
Yeah.
It's not just that I want you to do the thing. I want you to feel like you want to do the thing. And that sometimes it feels like all we should be able to ask is it should be good enough that the dishes are done. And that goes in both directions. But I think it happens when we care about something, or we have a set of preferences that we almost want the partner to have the same set of preferences. And there can sometimes be free freedom in saying, this is my set of preferences. And I like you, actually, I have a much higher taste for random times with my kid, picking them up and walking to the convenience store at 3:00 in the afternoon. And I organize aspects of my professional life around that in a way that my husband does not. And
Yeah.
not because he doesn't like the kids or because he doesn't care about equity, but because that isn't important to him.
Yeah.
And I'm always struggling a little bit with, to the extent that we do unequal amounts of parenting, which we do, to, how much of that is because that's really what I want and how much of that is an underlying inequity. And if it's just because that's what I want, how should I feel about that? And I don't think there's an easy answer to any of that.
Okay. So there's this piece that I really want to write. And I want to write like this article about the last thing that this is going to be very like man woman conversation right now. Right. But like the last thing I think husbands should ever ask their wives is what they want. Because I hate that question, right? I'm like, it's not that simple.
A Marshall Plan for moms, complete equality.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, and in this moment, what I actually want is for you to just know what has to happen, because the icing on the cake is to divide the actual task.
Mm-hmm. It relates closely to some of this idea that I talk about sometimes around what I call total responsibility transfer, which is related to the mental load. You get into these places where it's the version of, what do you want is sort of like, tell me exactly what to do and then I will implement it. When a huge amount of the work is thinking about what needs to get done. And so there's space there for doing a better job, probably for all of us, in saying you're responsible for this thing. That we're going to divide the tasks in a way, not that I'm responsible for everything and I allocate them like you're my employee, but like we're the co-CEOs or whatever.
Exactly. It's like, this is totally your genre and I don't have anything to think about in that. And I think that's what it comes down to, because it is that mental labor, right? To actually carry that and to have it all. And that's why you get to this point where it's like, I'll just do it. Right. Yeah. And I mean, it can be in the flip side of it. Like, we've had these like puking snowstorms up in northern New Hampshire right now. And my husband is the person who deals with the snowblower that has been broken for 3 times. Every like gets it back. He tries it, and it's like, I'm just like, I'm not on the snowblower team. That's like entirely your team. I'm excited about that being your mental load, but it's, like I'm not stepping in there to do that one.
Yeah. No, and we have something about, anything that's about electronics or cars or anything where I think he wants me to care. If we need a new car, which trim should it have? And I'm like, please don't ask me. Like, I don't care.
But see, that's you being like, just tell me what you want.
I think he wants me to have an opinion. I think he really genuinely wants me to like engage with this question because he thinks, I don't know, that it's important, or there's something, I mean, we're off topic, but like there's something about this particular aspect of the car trim that that is like a parallel to so many other things. And I can see now how he feels, because I'm just like, this is the 3rd email. I don't care. Yeah. Don't ask again. It doesn't matter at all to me.
But I think it's about like a shared experience, right? Like when you are carrying the load of whatever it is, you're like, it's this odd thing. Like before we had kids, I felt like nobody knew me better than my husband. Nobody knew everything that was happening with my job, like the ins and outs. And all of a sudden we lost that because we didn't have time to talk about any of that stuff. And so there are these ways that you kind of like, put a shot off the bow to be like, I need to think about like, the socks that don't seem to fit my children's feet for any worth. And like, I can't seem to keep these things on, and I'm actually putting mental bandwidth in it. And he's kind of like, why are we even I don't want to talk about that. I'm like, okay, fine. Right. But it's like, you're trying to find these points to bring each other in. And I think the reality of having young kids is that you just misfire with your partner all the time. And you can't see the misfires, and you're too tired and you're too caught up in whatever the hell you're going through emotionally that you're not seeing that your partner is going through that too, and you can't help catch them. And I think that is, one of the reasons that it's so darn hard.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that does get better, and partly because for the most part, you get slightly less tired and you have slightly more time, and you wake up one morning and you realize, oh, we could have a cup of coffee together and we could talk about something other than missing socks. And I think that's when the moments when that happens and you find that you do still like your partner are actually quite special, right? The sort of realization of like, oh, I'm really enjoying doing this and I wish we could do more of it, but actually I'm enjoying because I like you. And that itself is a nice realization.
Yeah, it is. It's also, I mean, I can do this now with hindsight. The irony is that I have no doubt Peter was right there trying his best the whole time. That's not a question, right? And that's the irony of this, that you can be trying your best, but again, it's like that misfire piece. So it's not only you find these moments and you say, oh man, I really like you, but also yeah, I haven't been seeing you and you haven't been seeing me. But yet that's kind of how we based our whole relationship before having kids, was that we were the people who saw and got each other. What a wild thing to then be tossed into being parents, sharing the most intimate experience you could ever share, but not sharing it. That doesn't make sense, but that's actually, to me, a summary of early parenting.
No, that's such a perfect summary. So I had one other more specific question. I was just curious, probably because you have a sort of shared experience. So you talk a lot about the inequities or the feelings of inequities when sort of Peter goes back to work climbing and you sort of do it at a lesser thing, not lesser, but like in a less intense way, at least initially. How much do you think that inequity was so visible because you have the same job?
Yeah, hugely, right? Because I mean, I look at people. I was in Kenya this past November, and I met this team member who I've been working with for Zoom for 3 years, and I was like, "Holy cow, she's so much taller that I had no idea." And she's like, "Wow, you are so much shorter than I thought you were." Right? Like our brains do this thing that we're like, "Oh, I know who this person is," and you map yourself onto other people without us knowing it, right? So I think in this way, while intellectually I know that we are completely different, I think that I always equivocate us. And it was much easier. It's like, well, we're the same. We're just kind of these different versions of each other. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, we are not different versions of each other. He did not gain 70 pounds carrying like twins and then have to have, an induction and 42 hours of labor and a C-section. And, it's like, no, there's just no way. And that was hard for me. And I do think you're right that it, like, having that mirror that was never a mirror, but is really not a mirror there. It just felt like it was more in my face than it would have been if he had a different passion, if he had a different career. And it manifests in these different ways because you also see desire, right? Like that's something I've had to really have a reckoning with, is that our appetite for what we want to do as climbers is different now. And it's always been a little bit different, but it's much more different from each other now with our kids than it was before we had kids.
Yeah. I mean, I totally resonate with that. I think this idea of sort of we're doing the same thing, and then all of a sudden the kind of foray into parenting made us, and I think for Jesse and I too, sort of made me realize, oh, like we're not really doing the same thing. And now we're like really not doing the same thing. But, for a long time we were sort of, I felt like I was doing kind of the same thing in a more just a not as good way, which was, more tired way, let's say.
Yeah, but it's all these things are probably like these dials in our psyche that when you lay them out like this, you're like, wow, those are really not functional. Like humans should do a better job, right? We shouldn't just see that we're the same as our partner, because it's going to it's going to bite you in the ass, right? But yet we do it, and then all of a sudden, I think it adds to the different tension points. Versus if you had some like more Zen way of understanding from the very beginning, like they are a unique individual. We sometimes cross over in these patterns, but we will always pursue it differently. Like you'd probably be healthier. But I didn't start from that point.
No. I don't think any of us start there. Okay, so my last question for you is: have the kids read the book, and do you think? I guess they're only 6.5, so maybe not yet. But do you think that you will have them read it?
Yeah, they know about the book, which is really fun. And I've read them little excerpts of them, or I've told them funny stories that I've recounted in it. They're too little to really understand the book. And because it's so intense, I want to be careful about when it's time for them to read the book. The whole point of this book, it's a book to them, right? So I remember early on, someone being like, you can't write this. Your kids are going to read it. I'm like, that's the whole point. It's like, I want them to read it because in my family, the family that I am like trying to lead with these two little humans, it's like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about this thing that's hard. It's like the Dr. Becky thing, right? It's like, let's go sit on the bench together through the hard so that you know that I can be there with you and we can get to the other side together. So absolutely, when it's time, like this book is theirs.
I think the greatest gift in some sense to your kids that they will be able to read this when they are going through this themselves someday. And that's I would have really liked that version of that from my mom.
Yeah, that's all I wanted. Like, I just like desperately wanted this like portal in time to go back and to be like, oh my gosh, you went through all of this. How did that? that created me. That's why I think that it's just like my brain would explode in thinking about it. Right. And even to this day, because whenever I would ask my mom about her experience when, she was at this point with her young she'd be like, well, I kind of remember this thing. I remember this jump thing that you seem to really like. And I'm like, really? That's all? There is so much more than a jump. Like you can only get 4 minutes out of a jump at this age. Like you've got to tell me what else was happening. But for her, it's like so far in the rearview mirror. She's like, yeah, there's a jump. And I don't know. We just kind of got through it. And I'm like, like, how did you go to work the way you did and put on your nylons and put on your suit and put on your heels and like deal with the fact that I was puking my brains out at some point in the middle of the night because you had to be there with me when I was 2 years old and projectile vomiting because I'm sure I did it. But somehow like you got out the door by 7:30 in the morning. How the heck did you do that?
I also, I do wonder. I vomited a lot as a kid. Like, well, how did you get up and like go teach classes after? How did that happen? I don't know.
Yeah.
And we'll never know. But your kids will know, and my kids won't know either. My kids will just like, I'm just gonna be like, oh yeah, one time you vomited after some mushrooms, but anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was fine.
It's pretty good. Yeah.
We just didn't need any more mushrooms after that. So that's all. All right. So the book is called More. It's absolutely amazing. It will be linked in the notes to this. And I just tremendously appreciate you being here. Thank you.
It's such an honor. I've been such a fan of your work. And when you wrote me back on email, I did a little dance and I was really stoked. So thank you for making that happen.
Well, good luck with the book launch. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, subscribe to ParentData in your favorite podcast app and rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the whole newsletter for free at www.parentdata.org. Talk to you soon.